Welcome to the DePaul College of Law Bluebook Podcast, a series of podcasts designed to teach 1L students the basics of legal citation using the Bluebook. In this episode, we will discuss introductory signals and using explanatory parentheticals. We'll be looking at Bluebook Rules 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5, with heavy borrowing from Blue Pages Rules B3. Signals are a shorthand way of letting your reader know what the relationship is between the proposition stated in your sentence and the cite that you provide after it. You can find signals in Rule 1.2 and B3. Signals can show support. The most common signal would be no signal at all. You use no signal in front of your cite where the authority directly states the proposition, or where the authority is the source of a quotation in your sentence, or the authority referred to in the preceding text is given in its full cite. E.g. is another commonly used signal. You use E.g. to introduce an authority that is one of multiple authorities or multiple jurisdictions that directly state the same proposition you put in your sentence. You use E.g. in combination with C to introduce authority that is one of multiple authorities clearly supporting the same proposition. You're going to use E.g. where citation to all those other authorities is not necessary. It's letting the reader know, here's one example, you can find others as well. Accord is a less common signal. Accord is commonly used when two or more sources state or clearly support the proposition, but your text quotes or refers to only one. The other sources are then introduced by accord. Because accord is a secondary signal, it's usually going to be lowercase. C means the cited authority clearly supports the proposition. C is used instead of no signal when the proposition is not directly stated by the cited authority, but obviously flows from it, meaning there's an inferential step between the authority that you've cited and the proposition it supports. C also is used to indicate additional authority where C would be appropriate. So the cited authority constitutes additional source material that supports the proposition. The use of a parenthetical explanation of the source's relevance following a citation introduced by C also is encouraged. We'll be talking about explanatory parentheticals in a few minutes. CF is probably the rarest of the supporting signals that you'll find. CF means that the cited authority supports a proposition different from the main proposition, but sufficiently analogous to lend support. The Bluebook defines CF as compare. The citation's relevance is only going to be clear to the reader if you use an explanatory parenthetical after it. Signals that indicate contradiction can also be used. Contra means cited authority directly states the contrary of the proposition. Contra is used where no signal would be used for support. You would use contra to show a case that came out with the exactly opposite holding or exactly opposite statement as the case you cited originally. But C clearly supports a proposition contrary to the main proposition. But C is the opposite or the companion to C. But CF is the really confusing one. Cited authority supports a proposition analogous to the contrary of the main proposition. The use of a parenthetical explanation of the source's relevance following a citation introduced by but CF is strongly recommended. Signals can also be used to show comparison. You could use compare, you insert your case citation, with, and your second citation. The comparison of these cited authorities will offer support or illustrate the proposition. When used as a signal, compare must be used in conjunction with, and the with is preceded by a comma, as is and when used. The relevance of the comparison will usually be clear to the reader only if it's explained, so once again, you'll want to include some explanatory parentheticals. Where you need to provide some additional background material for your reader, see generally can introduce that material. So this is used where the cited authority presents helpful background material related to the proposition, but it's not necessarily required reading. When formatting your signals, remember that your signal should be underlined or italicized using the same format you've chosen for your case names or your IDs. Note that the space between the signal and the case name is not italicized or underlined. Notice the space between C and Smith here. There's no underlining. Make sure you're turning your underline off between typing your signal and your case name. You're going to capitalize your signal if it begins the citation sentence. Otherwise, we're just going to use lowercase letters. In this example, we're providing additional authority with the see also signal, but because my see also is not beginning my sentence, but instead coming after a semicolon, I'm going to make sure I use a lowercase s on my C. Under Rule 1.3 and Blue Pages Rule B3.5, when I'm going to use more than one signal, I'm going to make sure that I list the signals in the order as listed in 1.2. Signals of the same type are strung together in a single sentence, and each authority is separated by a semicolon. Signals of different types are placed in separate citation sentences. So this means if you have a string cite of authority that all support your proposition, you can put each of those authorities together in one citation sentence, separating out each citation with a semicolon. But the minute you try to show any sort of authority that maybe contradicts your original authority, you're going to have to put any cases that would be introduced by a contradictory signal, like contra, but C, or but CF, in a separate citation sentence. All those contrary authorities can be placed in the same citation sentence. When trying to order your authorities within a single signal, you're going to be looking at Rule 1.4 or Blue Pages Rule B3.5. If one authority that you want to cite is considerably more helpful than the others, it should be listed first. Once you've listed the most helpful authority, you're going to use the following order to arrange the remaining authorities. First, constitutions. Second, federal statutes. After federal statutes come state statutes. Then we'll talk about cases, starting with federal cases. And in your federal cases, put them in a descending authority, meaning start with Supreme Court cases first, then move to your Circuit Court of Appeals, ending finally with any district court cases you may have. State cases come after any federal cases. Those should be listed alphabetically by state if you're citing more than one jurisdiction, and then within a jurisdiction, arrange them in descending authority, again starting with the court of last resort, then going to any middle court of appeals, and ending with any trial court opinions. After cases, we can talk about legislative materials. Legislative materials include committee reports, transcripts from hearings, and any of those other legislative materials that you'll learn about when you do statutory history. Next, executive and administrative materials. After that, court and litigation documents. This is where you would cite briefs, motions, or other interim orders of the court. Then we can talk about our secondary authorities, starting with books and pamphlets, followed by journal articles, and ending finally with magazine and newspaper articles. The only outlier to this general order are any materials that you wrote yourself, even if it's published. Those will come after any other authorities that you cite in the sentence. This order of authorities is a shorthand. For more guidance, you're going to have to take a look at the Blue Book. Rule 1.4, starting on page 56. Next, let's talk about parentheticals. We've talked about parentheticals before with respect to our quotations and with respect to our case citations when we're talking about capturing the name of the court, the jurisdiction of the court, and the date of a decision. But parentheticals can also be used to explain why you're citing a particular case or to provide some information about a case. So we use them as needed to explain the relevance of a particular authority to the proposition that you give in the text. They're highly recommended when the relevance of the material isn't apparent. And as you can see from Rule 1.2 and the Blue Pages Rule 3, an explanatory parenthetical can be formed by using a present participle, a fully quoted sentence from the original authority, or a short statement appropriate to the context. When your explanatory phrase is not quoting the authority, you're going to want to begin with a present participle, and you're not going to capitalize that present participle. Take, for example, the idea that maybe in your sentence you're trying to say that the courts would approve or allow for the use of this new chemical weapon that's kind of like tear gas and maybe incapacitates the victim for a short amount of time but doesn't pose any real threat to them. The courts have never had an opportunity to address whether or not this was an appropriate use of force. So maybe you're going to have to analogize to another case where the police used a similar type of weapon that the courts have addressed. So in your research, you find this case called Cop v. Perp. And in that case, they found that the use of pepper spray was appropriate in limited circumstances. Well, we'll recall from our signals that when our authority states maybe an analogous proposition that we would like the court to adopt, we can introduce that authority with the signal CF. So that's what I'm going to do here. I put my CF, remembering to put a space between my signal and my case name that is not underlined. Put in my full cite, and then I'll end with my parenthetical. In parentheses, finding that the use of pepper spray may be appropriate in limited circumstances. Notice there's no period inside the parenthetical because this isn't a complete sentence. Instead, I'm going to end my cite with the period as I normally would, without putting an additional period inside the parentheses. But a full participle phrase isn't always necessary. Sometimes you can just put in a shorter parenthetical, a noun or a single descriptive word maybe, that's helpful for the reader to understand which case stood for which piece of the sentence before. Perhaps your sentence in this second example talked about different types of non-deadly force that the courts have allowed the police to use. Then in my cite, I would probably list each of those cases, and then after each case indicate which type of force was permitted by that court. So here I'll say CEG, comma, because maybe there are many, many cases that have talked about these different types of non-deadly force. I'm just going to give a few examples. But then I'll list each of my examples. Cop v. Perp, and I'll just put pepper spray because that's what that case talked about. Use of force, maybe talked about taser, and so on and so forth. When your phrase quotes authority, if the quotation looks like a sentence and reads like a sentence, write it like a sentence. So going back to our cop version, imagine we had this quote from the case. The use of pepper spray is appropriate where the perpetrator poses a substantial threat to the safety of the law enforcement officer. I wanted to use that quote, or maybe that quote directly supports my assertion in my previous sentence. I can just put that quotation in my parenthetical rather than perhaps a full illustration and close it off and put a period at the end of my cite. In this example, I've given you a parenthetical combined with a short form cite, and you can see it comes right after your pinpoint page and before the period at the end. I've capitalized the first letter of my sentence, used quotation marks, and made sure I ended with a period which appears inside the quotation marks. If you're only quoting a short phrase, you're going to follow that previous rule for non-quotes though. So again, using our cop sample, maybe we wanted to put in a parenthetical that said something like, noting that pepper spray is quote unquote appropriate under certain circumstances. Notice I haven't used a full sentence, so I don't have a period, and I don't have a capitalized first letter of the phrase. The only period is the one appearing outside of my parentheses. Parentheticals are placed after the cite of the authority you're describing and before any subsequent history. This can actually get quite complicated. So you're going to want to make sure you remember Rule 1.5, because 1.5b will tell you all about the order of parentheticals within a citation, including dates, en banc, concurring opinions, and all those other little parentheticals we've learned about before. This completes our lesson on parentheticals and signals.